If I was going to succeed in this, it had to come from me.
This week on High Performance.
Maro Itoje from nowhere! Full of hunger, full of desire, and full of energy.
I remember the first time I went into Saracens. I was nervous but incredibly excited. All these players that I've seen on TV, I was now going to train with them. It gave me the freedom, which made it so that rugby would never be my full identity.
Our take on this, right, is that you're a human being that plays rugby. You're not a rugby player.
If you'd wanted to walk away from rugby, you were never Maro, the Saracens player. You were Maro, the son, the student, the guy that's got an interest in Nigerian art.
You need to want to sacrifice in order to make that happen. But even rugby at its safest will carry risks.
There's a phrase at Saracens, the shit that no one ever sees.
It could be getting up from the ground quickly and getting back in the line. It could be an extra effort to put pressure on the 10's foot. You're either positively influencing the team or you're negatively influencing the team. And no action is neutral.
I don't think you can be a leader unless you stand apart. You're a brave leader as well.
If you live a life of hard work and fulfillment, you'll probably live a high performance life.
Listen, I want to say a massive thank you to all of our new subscribers. But you know, most people that watch this content on YouTube don't subscribe. I want to change that. The more subscribers, then the more amazing we can make High Performance. And I've had a lovely message actually from Rob who says, I only recently discovered the High Performance channel and I watched the full Eddie Howe and Tyson Fury interviews, both some of the best content I've seen in the last 5 years on YouTube. Listen, if you agree and you want to keep this amazing stuff coming for free, then hit subscribe right now. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for doing this, by the way.
My pleasure.
Much appreciated. Welcome to High Performance.
Thank you.
What is your definition of high performance?
You know, I listened to your guys' podcast. I've been listening for a number of years, and obviously this is the first question that you guys always open up with. So in preparation for this, I was thinking, what would my definition of high performance be? And I don't have a too fancy definition, to be honest, but I do think there's a distinction between high performance and elite performance. I think high performance is relative. I think it's perhaps subjective to each individual. You know, what's high performance for you will be different to what's high performance for me, and so on and so forth. However, I think elite performance is performing at the very top level in your given field, whatever field that may be.
See, I think that's a really interesting definition. And by the way, this is maybe episode 170, whatever. You're the first person that has created that differentiation between high performance and elite performance. And I'm pleased you have, because often I think people are put off almost by the title of our podcast because they assume high performance is for someone else, not for them. And we try and drill home the message that it's your version of high performance, exactly as you say. Yet elite performance, it's about comparing yourself to others. It's about being in the company of others. It's about where you sit in that list of top performers. So how do you ensure that you're an elite performer, not a high performer?
Well, I guess there's several aspects to that. I think the first is being honest with yourself. I think after you play, I'm a rugby player, so I use rugby references. And after you've played at a number of years at a certain level, you kind of get a gauge of your body. You get a gauge of, how you're performing. And I like to think, other people may disagree, but I like to think that I have a relatively good gauge of how I'm performing, how well I'm performing, and when I'm off that, how that looks like, how it feels. So in order to almost hopefully stay at an elite level, I think requires a sincere amount of honesty. And you need to have a look at yourself and be like, okay, where am I? Where do I want to get to? How do I need to improve? I guess what's underpinning all of that is a general sense of always looking to improve, always looking to keep the ball moving. I think if you stay idle for too long or rest on your laurels in any given respect, then that is probably the time where you start to go downhill.
See, what you're describing there is the classic case of the Dunning-Kruger law. aren't you? But so the Dunning-Kruger law was named after two guys, David Dunning and Justin Kruger, that said that if you're good at something, you have the self-awareness to know why you're good at it. Equally, if you're not good at something, you lack self-awareness to know what are the areas you need to improve in. So I'm interested in how you've learned to do that kind of self-analysis and to raise your levels of self-awareness to constantly keep improving or picking up little areas that you can get better at.
Yeah, I'm by no means an expert of this. I don't want to sound as if, I've cracked the code. But I think part of that is innate. I think a part of it is, just how my psychological makeup is. I think I'm quite receptive to people questioning me or criticizing me in certain respects, especially when it's performance related. I think the other aspect of it is also the nature of perhaps the environments that I was raised in. When I say raised, I'm talking about from a sporting point of view. I grew up I've been at Saracens since the age of 14. That's where I, kind of had my formative years with regards to performance, and, the environment there is very much at getting better. Is very much about, people telling you when you're wrong, praising you when you're right. They're very good at that as well. But it's very much about trying to get better, trying to exceed and achieve that common goal. So I guess it's a mixture of nature and nurture.
Can we touch a bit more on the nurture? I'd love to know what was in the upbringing at home that not only led you towards playing rugby, which was a sport that you hadn't played before you finally got the opportunity, but then your dogged determination to make a success out of it. And I know that you hold your Nigerian values and roots very close. And I wonder, to what extent do you carry that with you in your career and how that's helped you?
Well, I think there's several aspects to that question. I think the first part, which I'll touch on, is, as you said, I'm very, very proud of my Nigerian heritage. It's a essential part of who I am. It's formed the lens in which I see the world. It's shaped me. I can't even describe how much it shaped me.
Can you expand on what and why?
Yeah. So I grew up in North London. I've never lived in Nigeria. I've been to Nigeria several times on holiday and vacation, but I've never lived there. And why has it shaped me in such a way? My parents were born in Nigeria, both of them. They both spent some of their schooling abroad, etc. But they were firmly brought up and bred in Nigeria. And I always describe my house, or my parents' house, as it was like living in Lagos but in London, because the house was very Nigerian in terms of culture, in terms of values, in terms of the food we ate, in terms of the people coming in and out of the house. But I step outside the house, then I'm in North London. So being Nigerian, or being raised in the way in which I was raised, has just formed my viewpoint on the world. It's the first reference I had to anything else, and almost everything else has been affected by that. And I guess in terms of what that actually looks like, I guess Nigerians have a very, very, they hold respect in high regard. So, my parents never tolerated any form of disrespect. Even to this day, there's certain things that I wouldn't say in and around my parents, because they hold respect to such a high...
bad language and things like that.
So I try not to use profanity for different reasons, for religious reasons, but I wouldn't if I was to use it in front of them, it would feel weird. It would just feel like odd. Um, so I'll give you an example. So in Western culture, in British culture, is not unusual to call, I guess, your auntie by her first name, by Jane or whatever. Whereas if I called my auntie like by her first name, I have an auntie Stella. If I called her Stella, it's like I'm insulting her. It's like a massive is a massive lack of respect I'm showing her, because it's just like the hierarchical nature of like Nigerian families. But even besides respect, there's, in terms of family values, in terms of hard work, in terms of community, there's so many aspects to it.
And how much of that do you see? I mean, we'll get on to talking about your professional career as a rugby player, but like, how much of that, you've described Saracens as your home, did you see a values match there from what you're describing?
So I remember the first time I went into Saracens, or the senior environment, and I was 16 years old or so, and they called me up to take part in the first team training. I was nervous but incredibly excited, and all these players that I've seen on TV, I was now gonna be in the change room with them and train with them. So I was super excited, but at the same time incredibly anxious and nervous. And I walked into the little corridor, and the first person I saw was a scrum half called Neil de Kock. And he was like, "Hello, Maro, how you doing?" Shook my hand straight away. And I was like, wow, this is one of the most experienced players on the team, and he's embracing me so warmly. And it really took me aback. Then we had players there like John Smith, who was Springboks captain, World Cup winner, etc., doing the exact same. So I was interacting with all these players, and they were, treating me with so much respect, and they were so kind to me. Someone that they don't know, just some young kid from the academy, and as there's so many young kids in the academy that it's hard to always show these guys the respect, or just be consistent with it anyway. But they were all embracing me so warmly. So it was, for me, it was like the perfect place to grow. It was a perfect place for me to try and learn and like expand my skills in that respect.
Can you share with our listeners what the respect and the values and the discipline that you've just talked about does for you as an athlete? Because I think that we still sometimes have a dissonance here where it's like, I'm going to be really respectful. Oh, but that's got nothing to do with performing at an elite level. And then we see other people performing at an elite level who we know are not disciplined and are not respectful, and we kind of assume that you don't need them both. But I get the sense that the discipline element is a really important one for the performance element for you.
Yeah, I'm not one of those players who I guess is I don't know if any of you see me play rugby, but I'm not necessarily the most skillful player in on the field. I'm not one of those players who can kick the ball 70 yards, or spin off my left, off my right, 30-meter passes. I don't perhaps have that deft touch that some players are graced with. My skill set is pretty much based on output. It's based on how hard I can work and the effectiveness of those collisions or of those involvements in a game, and the accumulated amount of those across an 80-minute window. So, and as you kind of alluded to before, rugby is not a sport that I grew up in. It's not a sport that I, when I was 1 to 11, dreamed of playing. I barely knew what rugby was at that point. So, I wasn't brought up in the tradition of rugby. So it really didn't come naturally to me. So what discipline gave me was the fact that I needed to be consistent with it. I needed to work hard with it. And even backtracking a little bit, um, my upbringing was very disciplined in terms of, you know, how we were in our family house, how my parents were with education, with studying, etc., etc. But they were, in terms of sport, they weren't disciplined at all. They were like, oh yeah, go exercise, but in my early years, didn't really care what that looked like or what that was. So, you know, when I first started getting into rugby, you know, rugby with Nigerians is not really a thing that they, you know, you don't really connect. So when I first started getting into rugby, it was seen as a potential distraction. I remember if my dad was here, he would always tell the story. He loves telling this story, so I'll tell it for him. But he told this story that, you know, my housemaster called him up and he was like, "Oh, your son's very good at rugby." Then he was a little bit worried that rugby may be a distraction, and he told me that he called me. I was like, if the grades drop, the rugby stops. um, so, but anyway, the point I'm trying to make with that is the discipline that I had through other aspects of my life. I was then able to transfer that through to rugby and how I trained, you know, waking up at a certain time, making sure I was eating the right things. And that was all pretty much self-driven because my parents didn't care.
See, because that's a really fascinating area. I'd just like to pause and explore deeper, because we have lots of parents that listen to this who maybe have aspirations for their children, that maybe the ones that are driving them to practice, urging them to go out and do the extras and things like that. And yet your parents were almost hands off and just gave you freedom to, if you want to do it, that's fine, as long as it doesn't affect your schoolwork. What do you think that gave you in terms of as an advantage as a young athlete?
Well, I think for me, it just made it so that if I was going to succeed in this, it had to come from me. It wasn't me relying on anyone else. You know, it was me having to wake up to catch the train, to catch the bus, to get to training. It was me having to, you know, tell my parents that, oh, can I get some money to get some food for this? Or it was me having to organize that. And I think, you know, it just gave me that self-motivation. And also, and this is also another interesting piece with regards to like identity. My parents, the way they viewed me was never based on how good or bad I was at rugby. So, you know, it wasn't necessarily a part of my self-worth whether I was good at rugby or whether I was bad at rugby. So in a way, you know, it gives a certain sense of freedom as well, because let's say, you know, I have some, you know, young cousins who play football, and, you know, if they were to get dropped, you know, I think it would have a huge impact on them, because they've got so much of their value or potential self-worth in the sport. And to some extent, you could argue that you need some of that, because you need to want to, you want to succeed. You need to want to work hard and, you know, sacrifice in order to make that happen. But for me personally, I think it gave me the freedom and probably the encouragement to explore different aspects of my life, which made it so that rugby will and to this day probably will never be my full identity.
I love that. I mean, there's a real echo there, as you're saying it, about, we interviewed Ian Thorpe, the legendary swimmer, and he was talking about the importance of early ownership in his journey. Of, like, his dad said to him, if you commit to swim, you have to do it for the season, but after that, it's up to you. But his other rule was, you have to wake me up to take you swimming. I'll never wake you up. So he put the responsibility on him to get up in the morning, set his alarm, get himself ready. And there's lots of research on this, that early ownership of an athlete actually helps them thrive over a longer term. But I think the stuff you talk about there, about the identity allows you to, if you'd wanted to walk away from rugby, you were never Maro, the Saracens player. You were Maro, the son, the student, the guy that's got an interest in Nigerian art or any of those other things. How would your parents describe you then? What's the kind of identity that you have at home?
Good question. How would my parents describe me? I'm not too sure how they would describe me. Ultimately, rugby would be, I guess, rugby would be definitely a part of that and an important part of that. But how they describe me, I'm not sure. We have to do a dial-in and get
Get them on the phone.
Yeah, get them to hear what they have to say.
What would you like them to say?
Well, the way I like to describe myself is like a multifaceted individual who has interests in a whole range of different things. But I think about it a lot because is also linked into the other end of the scale when it comes to like retirement and stuff. I think when you wholly define your life through what you do, if that is then taken away from you, it then becomes difficult. So and I've always been of the opinion that the other interests I have help with what I do with rugby. I remember when I was doing my undergrad degree. I'll go into uni and meet a whole load of people who have no idea about rugby and have no interest, and I'll be studying blah blah blah, but then when I go back to training, that's the fun part. That's the part that's interesting. That's the part that's fun, and it made me value the time that I had studying. That I had training even more.
See, again, that's an interesting area that I know you've spoke a lot, Jake, about your work in football, that it's often used as a stick to beat footballers with, that if they have interests in businesses or they're doing other studies, they're all, like when they underperform on the field, it's the first thing.
Well, it depends on the interest, and this is what frustrates me, right? If you're a footballer and you talk about staying home and playing PlayStation or whatever, then no one criticises it. We had Hector Bayer on the podcast, the former Arsenal player, and as soon as he showed an interest in fashion or an interest in photography, and we see it now with modern players who will go to, the fashion show in Italy or something. Suddenly, if they don't perform on the pitch, the issue is that they're more interested in fashion. And we live in this world where we want to put people in a box. And if you're the sort of footballer that spends hours and hours playing on a computer game, then we're cool with that because for whatever reason we think that that's all right. But as soon as you show a real passion for something other than football, we think it's detrimental to the game. I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I agree with the sentiment of what you're saying, and to a lesser extent, perhaps I think I potentially have experienced some of that. What I think, but on the flip side of that, also sometimes it's the truth. Sometimes players or people do get distracted by X, Y, or Z. So there's a balance that you need to find. And the way I've always tried to approach it is that you have to keep the main thing. Whilst I'm playing rugby, rugby will always be the focus. Then everything else will have to fit around rugby. I think you have to keep your focus on the thing that is important to you, and you can't lose that focus, lose that intent. However, that being said, when I'm at club, we train 3 days a week, with the game on the weekend. Then those training days, most of those days, I'm finished in and around 3:00. So if I'm, and there's only so much recovery you can do. There's only so much analysis you can do. So there's the point I'm trying to make. There's loads of time in the week if you choose to use your week wisely, to pursue any interests or, passions outside of your sport.
I mean, I've recently met Richard Wigglesworth that was talking about the culture that he'd grown up in, but that you're a part of at Saracens. And what really struck me in the conversation with him was from quite an early age, when he was at the club, he was being encouraged by I don't know who it was, to look beyond his playing career, to do his coaching badges, to go and take an interest in the outside world. Is that consistent with the culture you're familiar with, that you're hearing those messages yourself?
100%. It's at Saracens, they're always pushing you to do something outside the realms of rugby. They've got they have a brilliant guy, David Jones, and people in the organization who help players just find what they're interested in, and hopefully give them additional support to try and explore that, whether it's work experience, whether it's reading about it. And it's not always formal education. I'm a massive advocate of education and further education, but that isn't right for everyone. Sometimes it could be apprenticeship, it could be just work experience, it could be just following a passion and seeing where that leads to. So I think they try and find solutions to match the individual as opposed to a wide brush.
Our take on this, right, is that you're a human being that plays rugby. You're not a rugby player, right? And there's a really interesting book by Sam Harris called The Captain Class, where he basically concludes that a team is not about a star player or even about a coach. It's about the leadership in the team. It's about the captain. And there are 7 traits of being an elite captain. And, elite is a word that you used right at the start of this podcast. We thought it'd be interesting to explore the 7 traits that he talks about in his book and just get your thoughts on them, because I think all of them will resonate.
Now, can I just say that when I interviewed Sam, when he did his book, it came out in 2016, in the conversation, he cited you as a great example of one of these leaders. He talks about the captain class. We talk about them as the cultural architects, the guys that don't necessarily have to have the title, but they set the tone for the culture. And he was really clear that he saw you as a perfect epitome of it.
He's
so
very
the
kind.
pressure's on in terms
So
of the answers.
we're either going to prove him wrong or prove him right in the next
He's
20
very
minutes.
kind.
And I think what we really want from this is a conversation about, obviously we know it's centered around rugby, but it's really about the mindsets that people can take into their everyday lives, because effectively we're all playing a game. Yours is rugby. For other people, it's a different element, but we're all doing the same thing. So the first trait is extreme doggedness and focus when it comes to competition. I'd love to know how you develop that grit and silence the noise around you.
I think this goes back to, again, it goes back to focus. You just need to focus on what's important. If you've played at a given level at over a certain period of time, you go through highs and lows, and often is never as good as it seems and is never as bad as it seems, depending on where you are on the cycle. And I think it's important to keep that perspective, because when you go through it and when you're in it, it feels like either it's the worst thing that could possibly happen, or you're Superman and no one can touch you, when it's never that. So I think it's always good to keep that perspective and maintain the focus of where you want to go. And with this, what I found helpful with this especially is the people that you have around you. If you have, whether it's support staff, teammates, coaches that kind of ebb and flow with the highs and lows of sport, then it's much harder. If you have people who are also of the similar mindset of want to keep the focus, want to keep pushing, and not necessarily settled with the success, but also keep perspective when you go through tough moments, then it allows you to maintain the focus and allows you to keep perspective. And I think it just allows you to keep that doggedness when it's going well, but also when it's not going well, it probably helps you keep that doggedness as well, because you have to keep on going in order to get it right.
So tell us, when you describe that experience of going as a 16-year-old boy into the first team environment, or 17-year-old boy, what kind of things were you learning about doggedness and grit that maybe you hadn't had from your schoolboy rugby at that stage?
Oh wow, the the first impression was just the physicality of it. Um, it was just a physical. I was a 16-year-old playing with men, fully formed men, and I go and at school, as you probably could imagine, I was amongst the tallest, amongst the strongest, etc., etc. And I went into an environment where probably the nines could beat me up if they wanted to, the scrum halves. So it was very different. So and being the position I am, that's the bit that you need to get pretty quickly, especially if you want to accelerate your career as quick as possible. You need to be able to be tough. You need to be able to have that grit, have that fight within you. And at Saracens especially, spoke a lot about like effort errors. Like effort errors aren't acceptable. If you make a skill error, then that's on the coaches, or we can work on that. But what can't be in question is your intent. What can't be in question is your fight. What can't be in question is how hard you're willing to work. That's a non-negotiable. So I guess like growing up in that school of thought, and seeing players in the team who had that fight, who had that and seeing those players in the positions that I wanted to get to was like an example of where I needed to go.
But if we go to like the real granular detail of a moment when you're 16, you get put on your backside where it hurts. You're seeing guys that seem like they're a different level physically.
There's two moments that come to mind. The first one was I was maybe about 17 or 18, and I was joining in with again the senior session, and they were doing this like, I think it was a strongman circuit, like a strongman fitness circuit, and it was like we're pushing a prowler up and down like a relay type of race. So I joined one of the teams, and they were pushing the prowler. It got to my turn. I was like, "Ugh." I couldn't push it, and I think at the time, he's now a coach, Kenny Brown, was like, "Oh, we're gonna take some weight off of this little boy." They started taking the weight off. I was like, "Damn, I need to improve here." The second,
See, but if I could just pause you there, Maro, because like at that moment, you have a choice, don't you? You can either go, it's not for me. Maybe I've just sort of like I've reached my limit, or you've gone, I've got to improve. Where does that come from? Because this is what separates high performance from elite performance, I think.
I guess there was the level that I wanted to get to. I like to think of myself as a fairly competitive individual. I want to be, one of the best players to play. I want to be at a certain level. I had goals that I wanted to achieve, and I was with players who, at the time, I guess back then your goals always change, but back then my goal was being wanted to be a first team Saracens player. And that was then the standard of what first team Saracens players were doing, and I guess I wasn't living up to that standard. So I knew that in order to get to that standard, there was a gap, and I needed to improve in order to reach that standard. So I guess and with the way of life, when you then eventually reach that standard, then you're looking a little bit higher of, okay, now I'm a Saracens player, I want to be a first team player. Then when you reach first team player, England player, and so on and so forth.
And I interrupted you. You were going to tell me about the second occasion.
The second occasion was a bit in regards to, like, again, the physical differential between where I was and where I needed to be. It was my first game for Saracens. It was a pre-season game. I think that I was playing at blindside flanker for the game. Anyway, we were playing Rotherham Titans, I think they're called. Anyway, the rugby team in Rotherham. And, Rotherham are known for having gnarly forwards, like big, strong, physical team, mainly a set piece sort of team. And as, it happens in rugby. There was a little little scuffle that was happening, and then I came in to like protect my players. I pushed one guy, then he looked at me, then pushed me back. Then I was like, I just felt the push in my chest. I was like, "Whoa, this is the same teenagers that I'm used to pushing. These are men." I felt the weight in his arms, and then luckily one of my teammates came to back me up. Otherwise, I would have been in a bit of trouble. So that was another example of like me realizing that I need to get back in the gym.
This works though, because the second thing on the list of the traits of elite captains is aggressive play that tests the limit of the rules, which is exactly what you've described. Even as a 16-year-old coming into that environment, you were happy to do it. You're also renowned on the pitch as something of a trash talker. So I'm fascinated to just talk about this for a moment, because here we have this guy in front of us, eloquent, bright, well-educated, demonstrating control, not swearing, let alone in front of his parents. Yet on the rugby field, there'll be opponents thinking, hold on a minute, I met a different Maro when I went up against Saracens or England. So how do you marry the two characters, and what does that trash talking do for you?
Well, I don't know where to start with that. I guess I'll start with like, I think play rugby is an emotional game, emotional sport. And, you need to be, well, for me anyway, people are different. I need to be of a different mindset when I'm playing as opposed to when I'm just having a lovely conversation with two lovely gentlemen. So, I don't need to, carry that same confrontational energy when I'm here than when I'm on the field. So I guess that's one aspect of it. The second aspect, I don't even know if I'm a trash talker like that, to be honest. Wow.
I've heard people speak really complimentary, except when they've been on the receiving end.
I don't even know if I'm a trash talker like that. I think I perhaps, do engage in it a little bit. I think what potentially frustrates, opposition is that I can be quite loud. I like to celebrate the little moments quite enthutically.
And what's that about? Is that about affecting them or affecting you and your team?
Well, it's first and foremost, is like most of my actions is for me first and foremost. So I feel as if, as I said, kind of touched on earlier, I'm not the player that is, I guess, blessed with so much innate skill. A lot of my attributes in rugby is about, energy, is about the how many involvements I can have in the game, how many positive contributions I can have in the game. So I use those moments to try and G myself up with regards to energy and hopefully energize my teammates. And I guess the byproduct of that is it rubs people up the wrong way sometimes. But, the byproduct of rubbing people up the wrong way gives me more energy. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess.
We recently interviewed Sam Tompkins from Rugby League on this, and he has a similar reputation as being one of the sport's great trash talkers. And when we spoke to him about it, his answer was, I'll do anything for that extra 1%. And one of the things we spoke about was that while he's trash talking, he's not looking to see whether his opponent's listening. He's looking for the next play, and he's just doing it. It's almost like as that little 1% to get the advantage. So I think it sounds similar. It's not criticism, this stuff that in the book.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, I definitely see mine as first and foremost. It's definitely about giving, my teammates and myself energy. It's just the added bonus that it potentially rubs people up the wrong way.
Okay.
It's the power of these marginal gains, little things you can do, I think, that can create an edge. Let's talk about another one. Number 3 is a willingness to do thankless jobs in the shadows is the trait of an elite leader. We know that there's a phrase at Saracens, the shit that no one ever sees. Could you share more on that with us?
Yeah, TSPDS.
Is this stitched in your shirt, by the way, as well?
I beg your pardon?
Is that initial stitched in your shirt?
Is that really? That it is.
Oh, you mean, I thought you meant the shirt I was wearing now.
No, sorry, I should have clarified. That was a really badly phrased intervention. Sorry.
That Maro walks around with a reminder.
I thought that was funny.
I think in the Saracen shirt you have it.
Yeah,
It is stitched in.
It's all about you know, all the little things that makes a winning team or a winning performance that the outside world doesn't necessarily pay too much attention to, but without that, you know, the star moments can't happen. And you know, as with most things in life, you know, there's you always see the highlight moments and the you know, the big landmark moments, which, you know, captures everyone's imagination, but more than likely there's loads of little things that have happened in the background that have allowed that moment to take place. And you know, I think as a part of our processes, we try and pay, you know, significant attention to people doing the you know, the shit that people don't see.
Like what? Can you give us an example of what that is?
It could be you know, it could be a kick chase. It could be getting up from the ground quickly and getting back in the line. It could be just doing an extra effort to put pressure on the 10's foot just so his kick is 5% worse than what it would have been. It could be, you know, in the line out, it could be a little shimmy away from the ball for the people who aren't involved in the actual lift, which may just distract their eyes a little bit, which gives us more space to win the ball. You know, it could be anything really, but all those little things make a big difference. One of my coaches told me once that nothing is ever neutral. You're either positively influencing the team or you're negatively influencing the team. You know, no action is neutral. So, you know, in that respect, you know, everything matters. Everything you do matters. Everything you do has a consequence, either positive or negative. Is either bringing you closer to the goal or taking you further away.
Which brings us to number 4 then on Sam's list, which is a low-key, practical and democratic communication style. Now, this was the research in the book is really fascinating on this, where there's sort of MIT studies on it about leaders, that it's not about doing big Churchillian speeches, it's the way that they communicate with like quiet gestures or eye contact or physical contact is where leadership is really, it's like the glue of leadership.
I'll let a little secret out. I've actually read this book, and in the book they gave the example with Tim Duncan and
that's right, yeah.
And they're talking about how he's not, you know, he's not a massively loud person. He's not an extrovert, but he's very good at connecting, very good at touching base with different people, whether it's, you know, verbal or just like little eye contact and stuff like that. And yeah, it's I guess it's important. It's important. I think everyone has a different style of how to do that. For some people, it may be a bit more extroverted. So for others, it may be a bit more introverted or in the shadows. But you know, they both can be as effective as one another.
What's yours?
So I don't. The reason why I'm hesitating is because I don't think I'm necessarily the loudest person in the, you know, when in the environment. I don't think I'm one of those guys who, you know, you walk into a room, you'll hear his voice like dominating, you know, everyone else. But at the same time, I can be, when on the pitch, I tend to be loud because it goes back to that energy type of thing that I want to create for myself and for the team. So I can be quite noisy. You may hear me shouting and screaming and stuff. And so I don't know. I think I'm a mixture a mixture of both. I think I probably lean more towards like probably connecting with people, touching base. I like to think that if I do need to speak, I will speak, and if I do need to talk to the team, then I will do that if it's the right time and place. But I don't think I'll be described as the loudest person in the room.
I'd like that though. I mean, the next captain's trait in the book was motivating others with passionate, non-verbal displays. And there's that old phrase, isn't there? The squeakiest wheel gets the most oil. So, traditionally the loudest person gets the most attention. I like to think that we're moving into an era where it's not about how loud you are, it's about what you've got to say. Have you noticed that in rugby, that you can have an impact on a team without needing to be a loud, sweary, shouty, kind of full-on individual?
Yeah, massively. I think when you look at some of the most influential people or teammates that I've played with, they're often the ones that don't need to say too much, and you just know, you look in their eyes and you know that they're gonna do it. And all this stuff is great, and all of this stuff is very important, but by far the best form of leadership that I've come across and that I've seen is through example, by your actions, by what you actually do. That tells your team and teammates way more than any speech, any non-verbal communication that you can do. That's always the best form of leadership, is by playing well. And everything else flows from that, and you need to you obviously want to improve on those things, but first and foremost, it's about playing well. If you play well, then you're doing at least 70-80% of leading effectively.
I also think that you're a brave leader as well. And I know one of the traits is strong convictions and the courage to stand apart. I don't think you can be a leader unless you stand apart. And I've seen, over the last few years, you've had an opinion about social issues, political issues. You've spoken about Brexit and other things. How important is it for you to share those opinions and for people to understand what you stand for as a man, not just as a rugby player?
Yeah, I think authenticity is a massive part of what I try to be anyway. I try and be as authentically myself as possible, because I think because that's what I respect in others. I have teammates who hold wholly different views to me, but when they're principled and when they're authentic with that, I kind of respect it, as opposed to individuals who just sway with the wind.
Can you give us an example?
I'm trying to think of an example that I want to share on here.
Yeah, sure. An example that doesn't cause you any problems,
this
please.
one through. Even this is not my teammate, but an example being Novak Djokovic and his stance with regards to, I think it was the Australian Open and COVID, etc. He made a stance of not believing it was the right thing for him to do individually, and whether that is right or wrong is a different conversation. But what I respect about that, he said, this is what I believe, these are my principles, and I'm not bending. And normally what happens there is, you get threatened with, fines, you get threatened with playing opportunities, you get threatened with, how you're seen socially. However, like a principled person, if you're truly principled, you're like, nah, that's against my values. And whether you agree or disagree is, for me, a different conversation. What I respect about that is that he believes something, and he's willing to stand by it, come hell or high water. And I think there's something, noble about that, whether or not you agree or disagree with what he's actually said.
And I appreciate you saying that, but because I know that in the back of your head is that little voice going, oh, do I even want to say this? Because the world we live in now, people will try and claim that I'm in agreement with what he... And I know what you mean. Like, I think we probably all disagreed with his stance, but I think we can all also understand that without disagreement, there's no progress. And it's a really important part, I think, of modern society that we're possibly losing the ability to do, which is to disagree but accept someone else's point of view.
Yeah, disagree agreeably.
People can't do it anymore.
So I've read that, I might be wrong on this, I'd be interested if you confirm it, but at Saracens you've had things like book clubs or philosophy groups where you can have these debates around topics without having to seek that everyone achieves a consensus. Would you tell us about that and what sort of skills they've given you then?
Yeah, we used to have we haven't done it for a while, but we used to have this philosophy club as you've mentioned, and we'll explore whether it's like a Greek philosophy or ancient Greek philosophy, whether it's Stoicism or whether it's Aristotle or something, or maybe it'll be in or around a virtue, like what is honesty, like what is being your genuine self type thing. And we'll just we'll more often than not start with a dialogue, then we'll just discuss it and just see where it lands. And for me, it's two parts. One, I find that kind of stuff interesting anyway. So it's always interesting to hear / learn more about it. And two, I guess it's good because it gives you a different insight into a different point of view and your teammates' point of view. And you mentioned like art, and it's a little bit similar to art in the sense that we can look at a painting and your opinion of the painting could be totally different to mine, but we're seeing the same thing. We're seeing the exact same picture, but you could see that, oh, the trees mean this, then I think, oh, they're just trees, they don't mean anything type thing. Yeah. So it's that kind of thing, and I think it's always interesting to see a different point of view and test your point of view against theirs.
I love the interest you have in West African art, right? Because I think it's a really good indicator into not just how sort of multifaceted and complex and individual you are, but all of us, right? So I always sit here when we do these conversations and I think, man, I hope that this lives up to the expectations of the guest, which is an impossibility, right? Because I can't control your opinion of what this interview was going to be or ended up being in the end, which is why I think it's a really interesting area to explore, which is, what is the one question you wish we'd have asked you, but we haven't?
You know what? We briefly spoke off air about this and what I wanted to get out of this interview, and there's nothing really. There's nothing really. I came in with an open mind. Obviously, I'm a fan of the High Performance podcast. I've been listening to it for a while now, and there was nothing really that I particularly wanted to get out. I think I'm fairly comfortable with how I am, and
Have you heard what Johnny Wilkinson said about expectation on our podcast? And you talk about a multifaceted individual. There are a few as multifaceted as Johnny, and he's been on here a couple of times. He said that expectation just sets you up for a fall. You're sort of creating a story in your head, and then if what you've written doesn't happen in reality, then you have a disappointment. He also said that there's no freedom with expectation, because if you have expectation, everything you do is measured against the expectation rather than just exploring. I mean, his definition of high performance was explore. And the reality of exploring is that it's kind of brave because there's no guarantees with exploration. But I think it's probably the way you get to conversations like this,
Yeah, Johnny's a very deep thinker, and it's no surprise he's given such an answer. I think it's interesting, and I think he's right to a certain extent with that. The only thing what I'm struggling with or wrestling with regards to that definition is not necessarily the definition, but expectation does essentially set you up for failure, but it's also a key driver as well. It's also something that, you know, you have your expectation because you have your standards. You have somewhere that you want to go. You have somewhere that you know, something that you want to achieve. So it's.
But is it ever right though? Because if you set an expectation and go beyond it, well, you didn't set it high enough. If you set an expectation, didn't reach it, you still might have performed brilliantly, but then you're annoyed with yourself because you didn't hit the expectation. I know exactly what you're saying, but then I struggle to see the benefit of it. And I think it's a hard one because the human mind naturally sets these things, right? I do it all the time, but I can't see how it helps me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I'm probably more in that I don't think it's right or wrong. I think it's just, does it help you? And it's a tool rather than the answer.
Should we do our quick fire questions? You've heard the podcast, so you know them, right?
I think so. I think so.
Let's see. The 3 non-negotiables that you and the people around you have to buy into.
I think with this, it's, you know, what I would like them to buy into. I don't always have full control of the people around me. So, but in terms of what, you know, I think are 3 things that they, you know, is important that they have, especially if, you know, one that wants to be a positive relationship with me, I would say honesty is a big one. Just being honest with me, being honest with yourself. If you think something is wrong, tell me. If you think something's good, you can also tell me as well. But let's get to the point as opposed to beat around the bush. And, you know, from there we can build, and if something's wrong, we can fix that. I think respect is another one. Respect is just treating people with, you know, respect is massively important. You know, I think it's almost the foundations of any healthy relationship. And number 3, so honesty, respect, and I am going to go with, I'll say punctuality. I think just being respectful of people's times. If you're gonna be somewhere, if you're gonna say you're gonna be somewhere, be it. I don't really like being late for people. I don't really like it when people are late for, you know, meetings and stuff that I set up. So I would say punctuality is a big one there.
And by the way, this is now the Itoje question. I've rewritten it because you're right. You don't control people around you. So from now on, when you listen to this podcast, it will be, what are the 3 non-negotiables that you stand by and that you would like the people around you to buy into?
There we go. Yeah.
There you go.
What's your biggest weakness and your greatest strength, Maro?
Wow. My biggest weakness and greatest strength. Someone once told me that often the best thing about you can also be the worst. I think I'm very self-driven. I'm very independent, meaning that I don't often rely on other people for help. I'm very much, I think my natural default is to be self-contained and, you know, manage everything myself, which I think is a big strength in a lot of areas. But I also think it can be a weakness in your professional life, but also outside of that, in your personal relationships as well, because you perhaps don't open yourself up to other people as much, or maybe you don't, showing vulnerability isn't the default.
Right.
What's the hidden cost of living your life?
I think there's a few things. I think there's, you know, you make a lot of sacrifices with regards to doing, you know, what we do with regards to time, and you miss a lot of momentous occasions. Like just last weekend, it was one of my best friend's birthdays, but I couldn't go to it because I had a game. You know, the amount of weddings, you know, birthdays, christenings, family occasions, etc., that I've missed has been a lot. But that's a sacrifice that I would pay over and over again, because the flip side of that has allowed me to do so much. I think there's another aspect with regards to time as well, in the sense that playing rugby and playing at this level, it kind of, I don't know, it linked to what I said before, but it kind of stops. It kind of brings a disjointedness to your life. You go into camps, you're here, then you're there, then and it's, I guess sometimes it's hard to keep up with friendships, hard to keep up with all these different types of aspects of your life, and it's also with that, it's people's perceptions of you. I meet someone on the street and they recognize me as a rugby player, and I guess they have a preconceived idea of me, and because they've obviously seen me play rugby, they think that, well, I think there's sometimes a barrier that they think that, just because they're a fan or they're a supporter, or they know who you are, they can either like one, speak to you in a certain way, or one, demand an aspect of your time, or invade aspects of your privacy, etc. So I guess that's also a cost to it as well.
Can I ask you, just as an aside on that, how do you process some of the hidden costs that the generation above are now paying for, with the head injuries and the early onset dementia? How do you process that?
I think that's a massive hidden cost, which I probably should have touched on. That's probably, the biggest hidden cost is, the potential physical damage that you could potentially put on your body, and the risks. And as you've mentioned, the generation before mine, they paid that in abundance with some of the stories we're hearing with regards to early onset dementia and all those like mental illnesses. How do I square that circle? I think where we are today in rugby with regards to concussion is miles away from where they were. Like, even there's a mindset shift with regards to how concussion is perceived now. Even when I first started playing rugby, if someone was concussed, it would be like, oh, don't be weak, get up, don't be weak, get up and carry on. It was almost seen as a sign of weakness to come off the field with concussion. Whereas now, it's like, what are you doing? Like, get off the pitch. Like, who are you trying to impress here? So that's one aspect of it. But in terms of the protocols in and around it, they're so strict now. Unfortunately, in the summer, went through a concussion, like return to play. So I'm fairly recently gone through the protocols and stuff, and it's way more rigorous now than it was back then. So that has given me an added level of comfort to, what that potential cost is. But the other aspect of it is also, it's very few things in life are without risk, and I think you have to be responsible and mitigate the risks as much as possible. However, if it's gonna consume you, then you should probably move into something else, because it then becomes even more dangerous, playing a sport like rugby, if you're scared about getting injured or getting something happening to you. And there's, the thought processes are legitimate and they're very understandable. So if someone thinks that, I completely get it. But I think there's we need to make rugby as safe as possible, but even rugby at its safest will carry risk. So you need to either, mitigate the risk as much as possible and carry on, or if you can't quite do that, then probably move into something else.
Very good. Listen, it's been a really fascinating hour and a bit. What would you like to leave our audience with? Your sort of final message for living a high performance life, ringing in their ears. What would you like it to be?
Nothing too fancy from me. I would just say, hard work is the foundation everything is built on. If you live a life of hard work and fulfillment, you're probably more than likely to live a high performance life, and you'll probably be happy doing it as well.
I love that. And in many ways, that answer sums up the whole interview, I think. The words you say carry real weight and real resonance. And, I think you can be understated, but an overachiever as well. And I think that is exactly what you are. You don't feel the need to shout from the rooftops about what you've achieved. You talk about it with a real mental clarity, and it's highly impressive to spend an hour talking to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honour and a pleasure.
The honour and the pleasure's all ours.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed that.
I enjoyed it too.
Thanks, Maro.
I enjoyed that too.
Just a quick one to say thank you so much for watching this content on the High Performance channel. We would love it if you would subscribe. Most people that watch what we do don't subscribe. If you can subscribe, we can make this bigger, better, bolder than we've ever done before. So hit subscribe right now and help the High Performance podcast make a real difference to the world. See you soon.